let me try to do the TLDR version of that. Uh, after the U.S. had very little, if any, interest in Vietnam throughout World War II. Japan had occupied Vietnam in World War II. It had been a French colony before that. After the war, France decided to re-enter Vietnam, and the U.S. actually was not in favor of that. They believed that France should just forget about its colonies in Asia and focus on Europe, where the Cold War really mattered as far as the U.S. was concerned. But France went in, so the United States kind of had to back France because it was an ally. And in addition to that, and that's kind of I think the typical narrative that you'll get when you read about these things. But in addition to that, I think actually the post-war vision for Asia was really important. The United States wanted to create a capitalist Asia, and the bulwarks of that would obviously be Japan, and in 1945, China. Well, obviously in October of 1949, that part of it fell apart. So the United States, in order to put Japan in a position where it could rebuild and thrive as a capitalist country, wanted to make sure that the other countries in that area would be accommodating. And in places like Malaya and Vietnam, there were nationalist communist revolutions going on. And so the U.S., both to support France, because it didn't want France kind of going off the reservation, so to speak, with regard to the Cold War in Europe, and to try to make sure that Japan had countries nearby where it could get resources, it could get investment, it could trade, decided to make a commitment to Vietnam, even though within the United States, there really wasn't a great deal of enthusiasm for that. And in fact, the military thought it was a bad idea. That's actually the focus of the first book I wrote on that, the military in Vietnam. The military thought Vietnam was useless, not really useless, but not terribly important.
Really?
They wanted to be in Europe. They wanted to fight against the Russians in the Cold War. And a place like Vietnam, in addition, it's kind of strange. There were actually American OSS agents before the CIA, the OSS on the ground, who were helping rescue downed flyers. And Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh were helping the American OSS. And so these people wrote these really positive reports about Ho Chi Minh, and said, just let them have their independence. And they were comparing Ho Chi Minh to George Washington and Joan of Arc and things like that.
Wow. Was it because
it was really quite striking?
Oh, no.
But the larger imperatives of the Cold War. Thank you for a minute there. Oops. Oh, okay. Yeah. I mean, the United States, actually, a lot of these Americans said Ho Chi Minh is like George Washington. Sure, they're communists, but that's fine. It's not that important. But the larger imperatives of the Cold War and then what I would call economic imperialism in Asia clearly were more vital to that decision.
And that's what gets the U.S. in the war. Can you hear me?
Yeah, and it begins, I mean, the commitment is initially small, but then by the early 1950s, the U.S. is sending hundreds of millions of dollars to an area that was really unimportant prior to that. And, in 1950, $400 million is a lot of money in 1950. Yeah. So it's a significant commitment made against their own better judgment, actually. Even like Eisenhower thought it was a bad idea. And then once, go ahead.
No, was it the U.S. under the impression that post World War II they were just the automatic battle machine that could, of course, smother this small country in the South Pacific?
Yeah, I mean, and in that regard, what the U.S. did wasn't illogical. Why wouldn't they assume that they could defeat Vietnam very easily and very quickly? Yeah. But again, there were people within the U.S. military saying, not so fast. Hold your horses, but they just ignored that because, they had just won World War II, the only real superpower in the world. You have the Soviet Union, but the U.S. still has overwhelming, advantages in all kinds of weaponry and obviously economic. So, there wasn't a lot of hand-wringing about it other than people like Matthew Ridgway, who was the chief of staff, and James Gavin, who was, I think, the Army planning chief or something like that. So there were military people saying, whoa, it's not that easy, but they were pretty easily silenced.
Is it true that France gave the U.S. a warning
yes.
after their shellacking that, hey, maybe you guys don't want to play over here in the swamp, in in the jungle.
Yeah, and what's surprising is how little that came up. A few people brought that out. George Ball, who was kind of a like the official dissident within the administration in the '60s, would mention that. A few military people. I found a document from I believe the commandant of the Marine Corps, one of the major chiefs, who said, you see what happened to France? Well, that could happen to us too.
Yeah.
So they were aware of that, but that's France, right? France. What did France do in World War II, right?
Exactly. Exactly.
So I didn't really take that terribly seriously, and they just ignored it. Yeah.
That's frightening.
Um,
Go ahead.
and well,
No, you please go ahead, please.
well, the one thing I think is, well, I think there's one salient thing here because in 1954, so from in 1946, what we call the first what American historians call the first Indochina War began between the Viet Minh, which was a nationalist force, it was also a communist force,
Mhm.
against France, and that ended in 1954. Just like the anniversary would have been a couple of weeks ago at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, and the Viet Minh defeated France, and France left. They were smart enough to get out finally, and at that point, Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh thought that they had conquered Vietnam, and they would now be leaders of a unified country, right?
Mhm.
Uh, uh, because there were three in Vietnam. And Ho actually had thought this in 1945 too, after World War II, because the Ho Chi Minh and the communists had led the resistance in the World War II. But then in 1954, instead of Ho taking control of the country, the U.S. partitioned, the U.S. and other countries at a conference partitioned Vietnam in half and
Mhm.
created a country to the south. I call it inventing Vietnam. They invented the country. They just kind of, at the 17th parallel, they cut Vietnam in half. And then they had to find somebody who could run the country in the South. Anybody who had any legitimacy was connected to the Viet Minh, to the Nationalist Front. And so they found this guy who had been kind of floating around the United States, among other places, No Dinh Diem, who had been friends with people like John F. Kennedy and Francis Cardinal Spellman, who's a Catholic. And so
Mhm.
they put him in charge, but they promised elections in 1956. And there was never any real thought of actually having those elections, because even Eisenhower said if there's elections, Ho Chi Minh is going to win 90% of the vote. Everybody who surveyed it in the United States, CIA, Army intelligence, you name it, all said the same thing. If there's real elections, Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh are going to get 80-90% of the vote. And so that's kind of what led the U.S. to go all in. They
Mhm.
invented this country, and then you're kind of stuck with it, right?
Mhm.
And it was a very repressive country. Ziem and his brother, No Dinh Nhu, took people, they put them in the jails. They had like 140,000 people in their jails. There were a couple
Wow.
prisoners camps where they just induced famines and killed thousands of people, which I think is relevant because of what we're seeing right at this very moment in Gaza, right? Using famine as a political weapon. And the U.S. just, kept ratcheting up aid. The more repressive ZM became, the U.S. kind of sent more aid in because he's our guy.
Mhm.
Didn't have a lot of popular support. In addition to that, like I said, he was a Catholic. Vietnam is a Buddhist country, a big majority Buddhist country.
Mhm.
And that became a political issue as well by the early 1960s. So it wasn't like, how did this happen? It's easy to say, oh, how did this happen? But, once you started to see what happened after 1954,
Mhm.
the optimism was misguided. It was misplaced.